Anyone and everyone who plays this game for an extended period of time eventually develops their own personal vendettas against certain champions. Most of the time, their grudges are based on whoever poses an extraordinarily difficult or unfair matchup against their main. Common ones include Vayne top against Juggernauts, Morgana versus engaged supports, Assassins against ADC players, Malphite against Tryndamere, and so on. Even the most for fun players have that one matchup they absolutely cannot stand. Some champions take this a step further and develop a reputation for being toxic, not necessarily because they counter someone, but because of their playstyle in general. These characters are notoriously frustrating to go up against regardless of their opponent, even if said opponent counters them. So today, we're going to discuss the existence of toxic champions in League of Legends. But before we begin, quick shout out to today's sponsor, Opera GX. Glad to be repping them again. They were my first sponsor way back last year, and we've come a long way since then. For those who don't know, Opera GX is a web browser optimized for PC gamers. For any of you who use Google Chrome, you'll know it has a tendency to suck the life out of your computer's processing power for reasons unknown. Opera GX has a feature called GX Control, which lets you limit how much CPU, RAM, and even bandwidth is allowed to use, so that way you can better allocate your resources when you have multiple processes running. By pressing the toggle on each one, you'll know that it's working when it starts glowing, and then you can adjust accordingly. It even tells you which tabs are taking up the most amount of RAM or processing power, so you can pinpoint which one is causing trouble. Along with that, they have all the features of Chrome plus some extras. First is the sidebar, which you can customize with instant shortcuts to social media pages like Twitter and Instagram, messenger apps like Discord, live streaming such as Twitch, so on and so forth. And as for the browser, you can customize it in any way you like. And there's also the GX player, so if you're big on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, what have you, then you can hook it up to your browser directly. One other thing is that they now have a mobile browser too, which you can sync up with your desktop version to maintain bookmarks, tabs, and such. I myself have been using Opera GX for going on over 2 years now, and I haven't looked back, so if you want to give it a try, I suggest you head on over to the link on screen, which is also in the description. Good to be working with Opera again, but for now, let's get back into it. I understand that this topic may seem very heavily related to my hated champion series, given that Shaco, Teemo, and Yuumi were all featured there, but this video will focus more on the psychological aspect of going up against them rather than why the community hates them for the sake of hating them. This type of experience occurs throughout the entire video gaming universe, regardless of genre. If there's any form of gameplay entailing you versus some kind of obstacle or antagonist, there will always be something that is objectively frustrating to go up against. Some of you may remember the level in Super Mario Sunshine where you have to push a giant watermelon with the durability of rice paper down a cliff safely, all while dealing with some of the worst collision physics the world has ever seen and avoiding cataquacks littered throughout the beach. Another example would be in the Fire Emblem franchise. In any game with the mechanic present, Fog of War maps tend to be really unforgiving for the player. Or even if you did know, you couldn't interact with them unless they were visually on screen. The enemies would know where you were, placing you at an unfair disadvantage, as the lack of vision was a burden essentially placed on only you, not both sides. It would be the same as if only the blue side in League had Fog of War while the red side didn't. Now, these are gameplay features imposed on the player by the developers, which is less about toxic mechanics and more about game design choices. But the reason I'm opening up with this is to give you an idea of where I'm coming from when I say toxic champions. Of course, when it comes to player versus player scenarios, that's when the idea of toxic strategies becomes much more apparent. Naturally, the goal in any PvP game is to achieve victory over your opponent. Barring self and or community imposed rules, you are free to play whatever you want to and however you want to, given that there are included features, so fair game, right? In competitive Pokemon, the usage of stall teams is by far the worst, at least back when I was playing during Gen 6 and 7. For the uninitiated, a stall team consists of highly defensive and or gimmicky Pokemon whose primary objective is to whittle you down through moves like Toxic, Pain Split, what have you, in tandem with moves used to, as you can guess, stall for time, like Protect, Recover, Slack Off, and Rest. While this is very much allowed and effective if executed on correctly, stall teams aren't fun to go up against. For all intents and purposes, they win by preventing you from playing the game properly, blocking you from accessing a strategy. They're Pokemon's equivalent of anti-carries in League. Moving on to a card game like Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's a similar lineup of cards that focuses on obstructing you from advancing the game state in your favor, often referred to as floodgates. A card named True King of All Calamities, humorously named A Very Fun Dragon by the Yu-Gi-Oh! Player base, was banned from tournament play for this very reason. Basically, once per turn during either yours or your opponent's turn, all monsters on your opponent's side of the field could not attack or use their special effects. Cool card by design, but in a competitive landscape, it was a very rage-inducing card. You couldn't play the game if your opponent had one on the field. What do these 4 instances all have in common? They prevent you from being able to play the game the way you want to by inhibiting your options, not because you don't have the skill to handle it, the situation just didn't let you. In League, there aren't strategies that stop you from doing this per se, but champions. When you picture a scenario like Vayne versus Mordekaiser, what makes this matchup toxic for the latter is that Mordekaiser theoretically has no hope of winning against Vayne, like absolutely zero chance, provided the Vayne player isn't a complete idiot, which in fairness is very rare because you know how Vayne tops are. She basically gets the free lane. A lot of single instance counter matchups like this exist, but it's not like there are no answers to Vayne in regards to the entire board. She can beat juggernauts easily but might lose to mages, champions with high range, or assassins. Toxic champions garner a lot of their bad reputation for being able to apply this to most, if not all of the game's roster no matter the combination. To elaborate, let's look at Teemo. Dealing with Teemo can be extremely annoying for the majority of the cast up top. His equal parts good range, easy poke damage, high movement speed, and eventually usage of mushrooms make fighting him a test of patience more than anything. Ironically, a lot of melee champions can waste him after a certain point, even juggernauts. Up until that point, however, it's all Teemo. You have to spend most of the early game letting him do whatever the hell he wants. In the mid game, of course, his irritating presence expands to the entire map. Most, if not all, members of the enemy team are forced to take Oracle Lens out of fear for his mushrooms. Assuming your team lacks an enchanter like Soraka or Sona who can sustain you in neutral, setting off a couple, or hell, even one mushroom may be enough to force you back to your fountain to heal. Teemo's job is for the most part to prevent the enemy team from comfortably traversing the rift, thus restricting their options. If you think about it, no champion is more dangerous conceptually when fed than Teemo. At the very least for anyone else, their immediate threat is reduced if you see where they are. He can be split pushing bot, but the Baron Pit is infested with mushrooms, you never know. Fortunately, however, Teemo himself is quite vulnerable thanks to no disengage and very low durability, so if you catch him stepping up too far, he's a free kill. The same can't be said for the next example. Much of Yuumi's initial and persisting hate stems not entirely from her enchanting capabilities, it's the fact that she renders herself untargetable while attached to an ally. Generally speaking, unless you're absolutely sure you can tear the ADC apart even through all the shields, heals, exhausts and stuff, you want to go after the support first since they're far easier to kill and by extension, it makes killing the ADC that much easier. Alternatively, if you have a Blitzcrank on your team, yanking the enemy Lulu and blasting her back to the Nexus makes the ensuing fight a lot less painful. That's the defining weakness for enchanters. They have to put themselves in danger to help out their allies while having almost little to no combat pressure of their own. Yuumi neutralizes this weakness almost completely. Yes, she has to detach and auto-attack to pick up a shield, during which any crowd control makes her literally useless for 5 seconds, but 80% of the time, she's under the protection of her companion, and that companion gets juiced up so much that killing them requires a concerted effort from multiple members of your team. By and large, normal counterplay against enchanters is ineffective against Yuumi. You aren't allowed to comfortably play the game against her. See, last summer I made a video about anti-carries and how they carry games by preventing enemy carries from doing so, which is why they're widely disliked by the community. A lot of anti-carries are toxic champions, not all of them, but many. Shaco, Teemo, Malzahar, Singed to name a few, and I got a few comments asking me what's the difference between anti-carries and just standard hard crowd control, like how does Morgana's Dark Binding differ from Shaco's boxes or Teemo turning the rift into a minefield? That's a good question. Crowd control by nature is designed to prevent the opponent from doing anything so as to make it easier for you to kill them. By rooting them, you strip them of any movement options. By silencing them, you strip them of abilities. By stunning them, you strip them of, well, being able to do anything. If you remember what I said earlier about toxic champions, they're experts at not letting you play the game, and the way they do that is through more than just crowd control. Something that bothers me so much is when people say you can counter X champion with hard CC, like that doesn't apply to anyone else who isn't Olaf or Mundo. That's like saying everyone dies if their health goes to 0, so...
Now men, group up and hit it till it dies!
Crowd control is kept in check by its short duration and immediate tangible effect. You don't have to worry about it except for when it's used and after it wears off. Toxic champions apply a constant level of deterrence, psychological pressure versus physical pressure. No one exemplifies this more than Shaco. Last year, someone founded an interesting experiment to survey every champion main subreddit to find out the 5 champions they hated the most, and after the results were tallied, Shaco was commonly the most despised champion in the entire game. When it comes to stealth, true invisibility has a very low duration, is positionally based, or comes with an indicator that the champion is invisible. Akali's Twilight Shroud may last up to 7 seconds, but she's only invisible within the smoky donut. She's invisible, but you know that she is and the general area that she's in. Shaco's Deceive is a flash accompanied by an unconditional 3.5 second invisibility. He's able to appear out of nowhere with no prior heads up. So, unless you have Oracle Lens active, your team could be chasing down a Shaco who's baiting you into thinking he's running away, only to blink towards your team right behind your ADC. Furthermore, he has 2 very potent zoning tools, Jack in the Box and Hallucinate. Hallucinate in particular is a very big problem. When Shaco's hacking away at you and duplicates himself, Provided you're unsure of which shaco is the real one, you risk getting punished for trying to fight back. In other words, your only choice is to run. But it's hard to run away from shaco since its auto attacks slow you while 2 shift poison is off cooldown and 2 shift poison itself slows you. Then he places a box to cut off your escape. Now, I'm aware if you ping the real shaco before he splits you can find the real one, but that's impossible to do if he hallucinates while invisible. So to break it all down for you, Deceive allows him to get up close to you without revealing where he is, removing your first and only preemptive line of defense, Vision. Since he can blink over walls, you need really deep wards to see him coming. Control wards don't reveal invisibility either ever since the Assassin rework in 2017. Then he pops up right next to you with himself and a walking suicide bomb in the form of his clone, removing your first reactive line of defense, Counterattack. Accidentally destroying the clone will make your already bad situation even worse. Then, Jack-in-the-Box spheres you in place, preventing your last reactive line of defense, Retreat. If executed perfectly, shaco cuts off all your options, hence why people hate him so much. Ultimately, a toxic champion is someone whose kit revolves around depriving opponents of their agency, slowly and gradually exerting their pressure while you can't. Believe me, there's a huge difference in experience between someone killing you by overwhelming you with damage, speed, or mechanics, and someone killing you by locking you out of options. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has a list of fighters who can inflict damage and pressure from a very far distance, called zoners. Mockrock made a fantastic analytical breakdown of the class, so I highly recommend you watch it after this one even if you don't play Smash Bros. You can apply a lot of the arguments he brings up to any other game with a range versus melee dynamic. Anyways, the idea of zoners in Smash is that their close quarters combat is noticeably weak to offset their long effective range. Closing the distance on them puts you at a considerable advantage in pressure, on paper at least. The matchup usually turns into melee fighter doing everything they can to get close to the zoner, while zoners doing everything they can to keep the melee fighter away from them. Sound familiar? That's a lot like Teemo. He's got solid mid-range pressure in lane and near global range pressure with his mushrooms, but a good half or more of all champions can rip him a new one if they get their hands on him. Even melee auto attackers whom you think Teemo should be able to beat thanks to Blinding Dart. However, sometimes the zoner's long-range pressure is simply too oppressive to get through that reaching them is next to impossible, such is the case for Min Min. While she may be one of the most vulnerable characters due to her almost non-existent close-up game, her attacks cover such a long distance and wide area that some characters have literally no options against her, attributing to why many call her a top-tier character if played optimally. All the damage, speed, and combo potential don't mean jack if you can't get close to your opponent. It doesn't even have to be a range versus melee approach. Singe's entire strategy is to run around and suffocate his enemies to death with Poison Trail while flinging you around and grounding you in place to disrupt your movements. There's an entire meme created about not chasing Singed, and during laning phase he spends most of his time proxying, which prevents you from pushing the wave. Once again, he takes away your options. Throughout League's very extensive history, many champions have been the target of the community's ire due to being overpowered at one point or another. But the ones who are consistently disliked have one thing in common. They beat you not by being stronger than you, but by taking away your agency. How is a person able to enjoy the game when they can't use the tools they're given? But if that were the case, it makes me wonder why these things are in the game in the first place. Like, why does Pokemon have moves that encourage stall teams, or why does Smash Bros have zoners? Why does Yu-Gi-Oh have floodgates? Why do shooting games have snipers? Why does League have these types of champions if it's almost unanimous that no one likes them except for those who play them? Depending on the angle you look at it from, one could argue that it's a way to incentivize countermeasures, and to some extent I agree with that. A lot of these champions exist for the sole purpose of stopping one side or one class from dominating the competition uncontested. That was the reason Vex was introduced. Mages usually struggle to deal with high rushdown champions, and so they made a mage specifically designed to deal with that. Technically speaking, Vex removes agency from champions heavily dependent on their dashes, but not many people consider her a toxic champion. As I mentioned earlier, everyone has their own personal vendettas. If you're an ADC main, Yasuo's win wall is the bane of your existence, but that might not be the case for Hecarim, Darius, or Renekton. Conversely, there's a lot of widely hated champions who don't lock you out of options like Kha'Zix. He's got fair amounts of counterplay, so I'm honestly not sure myself. What specifically about Teemo, Singed, shaco, Yuumi, etc. make them toxic to deal with? I said earlier that it was because they take away your options, but further down the script I'm like, yeah, but how is that any different from getting one-shotted by an assassin? Cause you have no options to choose from when you're dead. So then I thought maybe it was their neutral game, like how Teemo harasses melees throughout laning phase or how Singed proxy farms. But shaco's neutral game isn't really the best, so I guess it just has to do with unconventional gameplay, if they exert their pressure on you in ways no one else does. That forces you to adapt to an unfamiliar matchup, therefore placing you at a natural disadvantage. But pocket picks are a big part of why League is so engaging in the first place. If everyone was a carbon copy of Garen, Annie, Caitlyn and such, this game would get boring really fast. So let me ask you guys, what do you think defines a toxic champion? I'm gonna stick with the idea that they don't let you play the game, but if you believe there's a better definition, then let me know in the comments down below. But if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter, joining my Discord server, and checking out my other discussion videos after this one. But for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.